I mean, it's called income property for a reason. And if the income isn't there, or you don't believe it's there, you should be extremely cautious about moving forward. We just knew from what the seller was doing in other aspects of his business that there was a real possibility that he might have been propping this up for sale.
Welcome to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association, providing benefits and services to real estate investors and rental property owners for over 48 years. With your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group.
This episode is sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com. Hello and welcome to episode 228. Many multifamily and apartment investors are looking for opportunities wherever they make sense. Today's guest found what appeared to be an excellent upside opportunity out of state in Macon, Georgia, that he and his partner got under contract, completed due diligence on, they raised the equity, they sourced the financing, and everything was all set to close until something came to light that changed the entire deal. Today, you're going to hear a story about why it's so important to keep looking, keep digging, and asking questions even after you've completed your due diligence. And here to tell his story is Ken Jenkins, principal for Integrated Property Group, which owns and manages 180 multifamily and apartment units in Southeast Michigan. Ken is also my cousin, and you may remember our conversations from way back in episode 16 and 17, way back at the beginning of the show, where he took us through some very thorough case studies. Ken, it's great to have you back on the show.
Oh, thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me.
I know there are so many other things we could be talking about, but I know that the Macon, Georgia deal is fresh in your mind because you just had your conversation with your CPA about it.
Yeah, that's true.
But before we go there, just tell us what you've been up to, because when we had talked to you last, you had found two great off-market apartment deals. You were building your portfolio. I want to say you were still like under 60 units at that time.
Yeah, I think at the time of our conversation, we had 30 units. During the time of our conversation, we, I think, had a duplex, an 8-unit, and a 20-unit, which we had closed on relatively recently.
Right. So let's kind of rush through the what's happened in the in-between. You've started your own management company, and you've acquired more units. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So I've brought in one general partner. His name's Matt McClelland. He's also a managing partner with Integrated Property Group. And we've acquired a number of small apartment buildings throughout the city, focusing mostly in the suburban Detroit market. And so we've done that through broker relationships, through off-market letter writing campaigns, and that's pretty much the acquisitions that we've made. Along the way, we got to a certain level, and we determined that we also needed to bring property management in-house. So we formed Integrated Property Services, which is the property management company that we use solely. And we only manage our in-house portfolio. We don't do any property management for unrelated third parties.
And why has that been important to your growth?
Well, it's the primary reason that we did it is we were having a difficult time aligning the profit motives of third-party property managers and getting the performance that we needed in the metro Detroit market. And so we recognized that was a stumbling point. And in our estimation, the properties that we had were underperforming what we thought they could do if we had a much more direct control over the property managers. Now, the property managers that we had, they weren't horrible. However, they had business practices in place that were meant to optimize their profitability instead of optimizing the profitability of the properties.
Now, give us an example. What does that mean?
A perfect example would be a certain property management company that we were using. It was their policy that if a tenant did not pay on time, you had to notify them to begin the eviction process.
You mean you as the owner had to notify them?
Yes, correct. Which seems insane on its face. And this is a property management company. I won't use their name, but they're still working today.
Still working that way?
I don't know if that's still their policy.
Shame. If I'm being a property management company, they better handle those types of things.
I agree. Yeah, and when we determined that was what had happened, we were 4 months delinquent on rent, and after talking with another department inside of their company, their response to me was, well, you should have called us and told us we needed to start this eviction. And, that was really, for us, was one of the last straws. They weren't doing a horrible job other than that, but it just, at that point, if that's the level of detail that we needed to be involved in order to be successful, we felt like just hiring direct employees to work for a property management company owned by us was the right way to go. And it's turned out to really have made a huge difference in the profitability of our portfolio. So we're extremely happy with that direction. Now, we couldn't have done it unless we had a certain critical mass of units, and I think we probably had 60 or 80 units before we made that decision.
And at 60, 80 units, what did that allow you to do? Like, who were you able to hire or bring on the team?
So at that point, we started when we had 60 units, and at that point, we hired a part-time person to come on, and we didn't have enough work for a full-time property manager. And she worked for us. She was the leasing agent, handled up a small portion of some of the billing, handled all of the tenant calls, did coordination for service requests, things of that nature. Once we got a little bit larger, and at our current size, we transferred that position to a full-time W-2 position. So now we have a salaried employee who's taking care of that. And in addition to that person, we have 5 part-time contract positions, which are maintenance and service personnel.
Great. And I know that you've built that to scale, and you're building your portfolio, and you've since started syndicating and raising money from private and high net worth investors. And we could probably spend the episode talking about that. But what I want to focus on is Macon, Georgia, because you had built out your system, your team, your portfolio in the Detroit area, Southeast Michigan area. And then tell us about this opportunity you found, why you found it, and why you were willing to go out of state to do a deal.
Right. So in late 2017, we were having a difficult time finding additional target properties in our local area. So we identified 2 areas of the country that we had connections to that we thought might be promising targets. And we looked at local cap rates and a number of things such as employment growth and economic opportunities, such as population growth, that we thought were going to be net positives for those areas. One of the areas we settled on was just south of Atlanta in a city called Macon, Georgia. Some of those indicators were very positive for this area, and we thought if we could go down there and make an acquisition that was sizable enough and put in place property management, that we could grow out another section of the portfolio there. So that was the intention at the time. So you could
scale the portfolio and the platform that you'd already built into Georgia.
Right, exactly. So the idea was if we could buy, we'll say, 110 units there, and then have that be the base. And then from there, we could look at targeting 30, 50, 60 units and incorporate that into, say, our Macon operations. That was the sort of the thought process and the strategy that we were going to deploy. So the first leg in that was purchasing or attempting to purchase a property, which is the subject of our discussion today. It's a 68 unit. We'll say complex, but basically it's a collection of duplexes and triplexes. It's covered it's a 10-acre parcel, so several city blocks of structures, a relatively large footprint for that unit count, I would say.
So talk about how you found this deal in the first place.
Well, it was broker broker listing.
So you established relationships with brokers down there first, or you just started looking at listings?
So in this particular case, we just happened to find it. I did establish some broker relationships in the Macon area, and I had some people down there working for us. It just so happens this was one that I came across that was listed. It was actually on LoopNet, which is crazy. Probably should have been my first indication that there was a problem.
I found deals on LoopNet.
Yeah.
You can find them.
Yeah, they are there. And so for my W-2 job, I was often spending time down in Georgia. So I had an opportunity during some of my trips to go through the Macon area and tour different buildings. And on one of those trips, I had 4 or 5 viewings set up, and I just happened to set this one up. And so it was a collection of duplexes and triplexes, sort of C minus. The buildings were in okay position. The area had really sort of gentrified all around, but the property itself was still a C or C minus property, and really what had turned into probably a B area. There was some infrastructure development around the area that was very promising. So we were feeling pretty good about that. And when I walked the property,
that's great upside potential. If you buy what's a C property, an older property in a B area, you can quite often invest some money into that property and make it a B property in a B area and really add some value to it.
Yeah, so I think we had some plans for what we were going to do, and there was a lot of area to work with. So there was open land. There was area for a clubhouse, or even doing some subdivision and potentially putting in self-storage. So there were some opportunities that we didn't fully flesh out because we didn't get all the way there. We underwrite the opportunity for what it is as we purchase it. So, I mean, as you've probably heard your listener or your guests say before, we try to underwrite on in-place numbers. And so on in-place numbers, we were purchasing at a 10 cap. So we thought.
Yeah. And just to repeat what you basically just said is in-place income this is the historical income and expenses.
Yeah, right.
You were buying on a 10 cap. If the property were to be run exactly as it had been run, you were buying at a 10 cap.
Right. And so that was a very exciting, for us, this was a very exciting find, because a 10 cap in a C area in Detroit, at least, doesn't really exist. It didn't exist at that time. They're very hard to find. You may find them in C minus D areas, right, where you could have some real significant problems with the quality of tenant and crime. But in this area, we really felt like we sort of hit the jackpot. It was great. It was exciting. It was an exciting time for us. So we went down. We met with the broker. This was sort of the October timeframe. Walked the property. Got it under contract. We had some negotiation back and forth, and we settled on a purchase price that's right around $1.9 million. And that was great. So,
and this was $1.9 million for how many units?
68 units, plus there was an office area that was a unit that was converted into an office.
So that was just under $30,000 per door.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not using a calculator, so if I'm off.
And I don't have one either, and it's been a year and a year plus since we've done this deal. But so the idea was that we were going to move the office into a portable building that we're going to bring on site, and we're going to take the unit that was turned into an office and turn that back into a rentable unit. And that was part of our CapEx budget. So I think we had intended to do about $250,000 in CapEx to the property in its entirety. So there was some work.
What was the strategy with that $250,000?
The primary strategy, the number one physical defect. These were all brick ranches, and they were either on slabs or they were on crawls. And the primary defect in all of the units was roofs. And with the number of structures we had, and I believe there were 20 plus structures, I think 26 structures in total, all ranch style, brick, duplexes and triplexes. But they all needed new roofs. Not all of them, but the majority of them needed new roofs. That plan, that was the majority of not the majority, that was the largest item in the capital expense budget, about $110,000 in roofs. And so that was it was an obvious defect at the very beginning. So when we made our offer, we sort of underwrote those costs, and there was nothing to be sort of determined. It wasn't like it was a surprise. We knew. And actually, one of the things we learned during this process is that the labor to install roofs down in Georgia, at least in this area of Georgia, was much lower than the labor rate to install a roof in Michigan. And it was a pretty significant difference in a per square basis. So it was about 30% less overall in cost, which was
that's great news.
Yeah, right. It was all good news, right, as far as we were concerned, because when we first wrote this, we were underwriting the replacement cost per square based on Michigan prices. And during our due diligence phase, when we were getting these quotes back, I was looking at these and I was wondering if they had counted the same number of structures that I had counted, so I was on the phone with 2 or 3 different guys and making sure that we were talking about the same scope of work. Because as you know, if you get a quote back from vendors and it's really far off, your first suspicion is the scope of work was not fully comprehended. So anyway, at that point, it seemed like very positive.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about Green Property Management. Not only do they manage everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area, they also manage my entire portfolio. So I can tell you from personal experience that their unique flat fee management style is worth a closer look. If you feel that your property isn't operating to its fullest potential, then Green Property Management can help you take a holistic approach that will save you money, eliminate your headaches, and increase your net income. And if you're a property manager interested in applying Green Property Management's model, give them a call at 1-866-95-GREEN or visit them on the web at greenpropertymgt.com. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I just had a flashback. And I'm sorry, I'm going to deviate from your story because I have to tell this story. I just had a flashback to when I owned a single family down in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And I had to hire a roofer because my management company, they gave me 3 quotes and I picked one, and I had to call the guy and give him my credit card number. So he would call me and I would call him just to say, hey, how's the project going? And he'd call me and give me updates, but he'd call me late in the evening. And I think he might have been drunk or something when he'd call me. And he'd tell me about the problems he was having putting the roof on the house. And but he's going to get it done. And I think that it went on like 4 or 5 times longer than it should have to get that roof done. But he had the good quote. He was the one who had the less expensive, and he had a decent reputation. And he ended up finishing up the roof. And I called him and I said, okay, great. My management company tells me you're done. Send me your bill. Never heard from him. So I called him again. I kept leaving voicemails for him. I'm happy to pay you. Send me the invoice, and I will pay you. I never heard from him. He never sent me I don't know if he died or what.
Well, that's horrible if he died, unfortunately.
What do I do? What do you do in that situation? I'm sure I paid up front for the materials and stuff, but I still owed him at least $4,000, I think.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, our strategy is we pay for bills that are presented, mm-hmm. and we make a good faith effort to pay our vendors. We do, but we don't pay for bills that.
You're not going to chase your vendors.
No,
saying,
we don't.
Give
chase
me that
our
invoice so I can pay it now. Yeah, I pay all my bills, by the way, but I never got that one, and I never paid it.
Yeah,
but I did leave them some voicemails.
It happens. It happens one way, and sometimes it happens the other. We did an environmental survey, and the phase 1, because it was across a couple of parcels that were not directly adjacent, was $3,500. And when we got the bill, they did 2 phase 1 surveys. The quote clearly said it was for both phase 1 surveys, and I got the bill from the environmental company's accounting division, and they charged $7,000. And so sometimes it happens in the opposite direction as well, and you have to be vigilant.
Let me get this right. You did the work twice, the same work twice.
No, it was a simple conversation. They corrected it as well, and we of course offered payment as soon as we got the updated invoice. But yeah, so back to
I'm sorry I interrupted. You were telling me you got these roof quotes that were just way lower than you expected.
Yeah, well, as it turns out, as you know, the moral of the story here is we didn't end up closing on this property. So we never paid a roofer one way or the other. So at this time, we're in coming towards the end of the year, and this area of Georgia, specifically where we're at, was in a Fannie and Freddie Mae pre-approval area. And I don't understand exactly what that means, other than to say the underwriters that we had said that it was going to be additional work to get Fannie or Freddie financing. Actually, because the properties were on septic, and I didn't understand the impact that would have on our financing, it limited our financing
because
options.
They weren't on city water and sewer. They had a septic system,
right? And that's very common for this area of Georgia.
When I said city water and sewer, were they on a well as well?
No, they were on city water.
Water, but not sewer.
Yeah, not sewer. And it was possible to hook up to a sanitary sewer, which was installed at the one edge of the property, but the property is very large. I mean, 10 acres and several city blocks, pardon me.
Some major construction project.
So it would have been
major infrastructure.
Yeah, it wasn't something that we had intended to do. And there, with the financing options in front of us, it didn't make sense to add that to the capital budget just to conform to those financing guidelines. What we were facing was there was some insurance money that was available. Our broker had presented a few options: insurance money, CMBS, and then there were some local financing options.
And those are all lenders. So when you say insurance
lenders.
Money, that's insurance companies like to make loans on apartments,
Correct.
Just like any other institution.
Right. So there was an option, and it was an insurance. I'm not going to use their names, but there was an insurance company. It's basically insurance company money.
And they weren't as concerned about the septic.
Correct, yeah. Mm-hmm. There was a consortium of credit unions also, and then there was CMBS money.
Commercial mortgage-backed
securities, securitization, I guess. Those were sort of the larger options, and then there were two local lenders who were willing to loan on this property. And so we went through our options with everyone. We settled on the CMBS loan because it offered us the best amortization period and the lowest interest rate. But there were some additional upfront costs associated with them. It was actually a little bit expensive for us to get this loan. I mean, they're prepaid. They had prepaid lender legal, and some non-refundable commitment fee, which ends up being material later in the story.
Yeah, how much to get this? How much was the non-refundable fee? Because you have to pay it. If I recall, you pay them up front. And you're paying them for their legal, for the third-party reports they're going to order, all those things.
Yeah, it was $35,000, and some of it was based on their lender legal was like billed by the hour, it was by actual spend. Mm-hmm. So, we'll get to what ended up happening with that money later on. Yeah. But some of the things were like immediately non-refundable. So there was, in that $35,000, I think there was a $10,000 like application fee, right? So $10,000.
Yeah, it's costly when you buy these larger complexes and you get the better types of loans, the institutional type loans. The fees can be quite high, but the terms are so good that you get that back over savings.
That's right. Yeah.
And by the way, when you talk about had a better amortization, I'm assuming you were able to get a 30-year amortization. Correct. So which costs you less per month, gives you more cash flow, rather than like a traditional bank might want a 15 or 20-year amortization.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the options that were in front of us were at the two local banks, we could have a 15 or 20-year amortization. The insurance money and the credit union money were both 25-year maximum, and I think the credit union wanted 20-year, but was willing to with some stipulations go to 25. So at the end of the day, the CMBS, from a cash flow perspective, the CMBS option for us was the clear winner.
Yeah, they tend to have really good terms.
Yeah.
Especially if it sounded like Fannie and Freddie were going to be more cumbersome because of the septic system.
Not even an option.
Oh, so
actually.
they are out of the game because they won't even deal with it. Huh? Okay.
Yeah.
So when you get to this point where you have to put down a $35,000 non-refundable fee, or part of that's sounds like some of it's refundable, but most of it probably not.
Right.
You at that point, you've already done a lot of your physical inspection, your due diligence, so you know that this is a go.
Right. So
and everything. So you had done all that. Talk about that phase of it.
Right. So I skipped ahead a little bit to the choice of financing, but you're exactly right. So, like every investigation, you want to do it in the most cost-effective manner. So we want to find things that are going to rule the deal out or confirm things that we need beforehand. So we did some preliminary underwriting. We made an offer. That offer was negotiated and then accepted, and we went under contract. Then the official due diligence period started. And so during this period, we were doing things such as verifying income by getting the seller's bank statements. The seller gave us access to his online software. It's sort of like the Buildium or the AppFolio.
The rental management software.
Rental management software, right? So he gave us direct access to that, which we felt really pretty good about. And we began running the necessary reports that we knew the bank would need. So the T3, T6, T9, T12. This was probably the December, roughly getting close to the November time frame, we'll say, before Thanksgiving. And I don't know how this has worked out, but we've had a number of acquisitions that always seem to be happening through the Thanksgiving and Christmas time period. And so this always ends up being a problem with the holidays, and everything takes so much longer because people aren't in the office. And this one just happened to work that way. By the time I think we got it under contract, it was maybe the beginning of November. And then, of course, Thanksgiving was coming up, and everyone was going out of town, including the seller, who was out of town for a significant period of time. But they worked with us, and so we did first of all our financial due diligence, and that includes looking at the seller's finances, verifying as much as we possibly can, so we're making sure that it makes sense. And in this case, because everything was on a septic system, and we had already identified that was going to limit our financing options. And everything that we own is on sanitary sewers. We know what we would do with sanitary sewers. We hire someone to come out and scope them, and then you can see whether or not there's any major problems that will be a $10,000 or $20,000 bill to repair. And it's money well spent. But we weren't quite certain how to handle that with the septic system. So we were paying special attention to this. So we got all the plumbing bills. We laid them all out. We went to the city. We determined whether or not there were survey records for where each septic and sanitary field was at. Because remember, this is 23 different structures. Some of them had common septic systems, and some of them are separate from one another. So we spent a lot of time sort of doing that. We were on the phone there were two main plumbers that the seller was using. We were on the phone talking with them, verifying invoices, what invoices actually meant. And the vendors were actually very, very cooperative with us. We were feeling pretty good because we felt like they were being open with us, and they were telling us what charges meant what. We went through a learning process for, what does this system mean? So,
and by the way, it's great that you were actually talking to the vendors who had been doing the work, because a lot of times you get one story from the owner who says, oh yeah, that's not a problem, it's this and such and whatever. But then you talk to the guy who's actually doing the repairs, and he'll give you the real story in most cases.
Yeah. So, and one of the other things that we do during this time period is obviously we're getting quotes, rough estimates for insurance from vendors for the area. We're doing everything to fill out, what are our operating costs going to be moving forward. One of the things we also do is we go to the local police station and fill out a Freedom of Information request for all the calls to the property, and then we get that. And that Typically, they charge you per sheet for that report. However, if you let them know what you're going to do with it, that is, you're purchasing a property that's got a lot of tenants, your plan is to clean it up, and you say something like, our strategy is that you're available to come as the police when there's an actual problem, and that we're not going to have tenants who are calling to use you as a counselor. They typically really accept that, and a lot of times we've gotten our FOIAs filled out. And they're just like, no, just take it. It would normally be $150 for this thick sheet of ream of paper, but you can just have it.
Hey, I've never heard of this strategy. So you're
oh, really?
freedom of information.
Yeah. So we go to
asking them for all the calls that have come
all the
from
calls,
that
and what they do is the reason.
Like, are you listening to the 911 calls, or just the
print out every police report and they redact all of the personal information. So that's why it costs so much money per sheet. They'll redact the personal information, and you can get it. And it sometimes takes 2 to 3 weeks to actually get them to do it. But if you tell them what you're gonna use this information for, they're usually very open, because my take on law enforcement is that they don't necessarily like being used as adult babysitters, and they're perfectly fine with coming out to investigate actual crime. And if you present it in that manner, we've found that they're very open and willing. As a matter of fact, we've never made a single purchase that we haven't done that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I know a lot of people look at the crime statistics or the crime map in the area, or call the police department just to have a chat with somebody. But I've never heard of. That's very thorough.
Yeah. It's pretty. It's not
reports.
difficult. Yeah. You have to go in person, and you have to pay. We have paid as well, but not always. A lot of times they say you have to pay, and then you go to get the report, and we're like, well, how much do we owe? And they're like, no, just, look on page 62.
Just do good with this.
Just look on page 62. And there's no personal identifiable information, but you can really put the picture together pretty readily.
So what did you find out from this
actually
exercise?
There was very little going on there. And that was a very promising thing. So because of the nature of when I went down, I was typically there during the daytime, and I wasn't certain what the neighborhood would be like at night. Sometimes when people get off of work, the nature of the neighborhood, the quality of the people and their actions change during the evening time. So we did come down a couple of nights during the evening time on a Friday night, and then on like a Wednesday night, and just sort of wandered around and walked around. And when we did that, especially on the Friday night, I immediately knew there was going to be no problem, because if I feel safe walking around on a Friday night in an area, you know that it's just fine. Mm-hmm. So we had done all of that before we really committed to spending the money.
And it sounds like the physical inspection part too was completed, and you knew you had to replace a lot of roofs.
Well, we knew that, like I said, that was obvious from the beginning. So we started with the financial, or we'll say the paperwork due diligence. That took us about 2.5 weeks to get done with, and then we called in our own inspector, and we did an inspection. That took us about a day on site, and that physical inspection showed us everything that we needed to know. And then the lender wanted another property condition report, so we called in a separate person to go back in and do that. So we kind of did it twice. But it was really a function of the fact that we didn't want to commit that money to the lender first. We wanted to make sure that we thought the deal was good. Sure. And we felt extremely confident because we were looking at the same system they were using to record and pay the bills, and it just seemed unlikely that there was anything else.
You mean when you were looking at the owner's management software?
Correct. Yeah.
All the income and expenses.
Right.
You felt like you were being given a real glimpse behind the curtain as to what was really being spent and what the real income was. Right.
And we felt like at that time, the only thing we really couldn't verify is whether or not those entries in that system were On the income side, were validated with the bank statements. So we got the bank statements from the seller, which he provided, and they matched fairly well. I mean, there are always discrepancies because income is recorded in 1 month on the income ledger, and then it might be deposited, 3 days later or 2 days later, depending on what day of the week the check comes in and when it hits the bank. So always you expect to see a small discrepancy, and it was within the range of what we knew was reasonable based on our operations back here in Michigan.
Right. So, was there anything else leading up to when you committed this $35,000 to get the loan started? Anything else that stood out, good or bad, that really got you excited about the property, or said, "Well, this might be a red flag"?
Well, I would say that there were a couple of things. One was that there was a trailer park that was adjacent to the property that was in pretty poor repair, and that was a negative. But then on two sides, there were additional duplexes which had been sold off to owners that were on two adjacent blocks. Now, those duplexes that were sold off to owners were renting out for $950 a side, and the duplexes that were exactly physically identical in this property were being rented between $500 and $550 a side. So we just knew there was like incredible.
So that's like
upside.
$450 upside on each unit.
Depending on and now we didn't get an opportunity to go into any of those duplexes. So it is possible that they were upgraded in certain ways that we weren't aware of, but the
still that's significant
structure,
upside. Whether you achieve upside. Even if you got 50% of that,
correct,
that's still $250 per door that you could raise rents.
Right. So we were feeling extremely confident. So on one side there was sort of a negative little eyesore. It was like 2 blocks of a dilapidated sort of mobile home community. We'll call it that, but that's extremely generous. I mean, it was in bad shape. And the municipality was in the process of ticketing and forcing the removal of dilapidated trailers. And it was sort of like the entire area was getting nicer, so we weren't extremely concerned about that. It would be nice for it to be gone, but we felt like the size of this property, you could live in one area and not even know about the trailers being several blocks away because of the way you accessed it from the main road and what was around. So we were feeling very good about very good about the opportunity. Now, we were like many people, we were trying to schedule our closing at the beginning of a month, and if you schedule a closing at the beginning of the month, depending on how your purchase agreement is written, it changes the amount of cash that you need to bring to close, because if because you're prorating the rents. So on the first of the month, if your purchase agreement is written correctly, you can get credit for those rents. And if you close on the last day of the month, you don't get credit for the rents, or the proration would be basically zero. So we were trying to close as early as we could in January. But because of the Christmas holiday and everything, that was getting pushed out further and further. So the commitment that we received was that we would close on approximately January 16th or something like that. So about the middle of the month. And we felt okay about that, but we had requests back to the lender that we'd really like to push it back. Our purchase agreement gave us, I think, an additional 3 weeks. So we could have closed as late as the first week in February. So they said, well, we'll see what we can do, but, we bundle these things up and, we put them on a schedule. So you're either going to make this one or you're not. So we need to close it in the middle of January. So what happened at the beginning of January, so everything was going well. Let me back up just a second.
Yes.
We went back, we determined that we needed to raise about $800,000 to do this. Okay. So we went out to our investors and we syndicated the deal. So we had the syndication paperwork made up.
Yeah, so you're paying legal fees,
Paying
to have
legal
the
fees.
PPM and the
Yeah.
operating agreement and everything put together.
Right, exactly. So we've made the commitment by, we'll say, sort of the beginning of December that we were going to go forward, and we paid $35,000 in a commitment fee to the lender. Okay. And then we had one of those things that we needed to do was an ALTA survey. And because of the nature, the size of the property, the nature of the lending, and the number of structures, we had to do an ALTA survey, not just a normal mortgage survey. And because of the size of this, the best price that we could get on it that worked in our time frame was $8,000. So we had to do an $8,000
So
survey.
you're committing $8,000 before you close.
Yeah, before we close. Yeah, $8,000. $12,000 in syndication attorney. That's our syndication attorney, not the lender's legal. Those are two completely different things. And then we had our own inspection costs. So it's not unusual to pay for estimates in a situation where you don't own the property and there's not really a guarantee for work. So we were paying for things like roofing estimates. We were paying plumbers to come out before we even got the property condition report from the lender. So we had about $3,000 in total inspection fees. So we had committed a fair amount of money. And now on top of that, we had a $60,000 earnest money deposit, I think, which went hard, we'll say December 15th, roughly. So we were all into this thing for, around $100,000 at that point. So fast forward to January now.
And by the way, you needed to raise $800,000. It sounds like you had commitments already from investors.
We had
so
more
you
than
filled that.
Right. So we had more than
easily.
commitments. We got to the end of the first week in January, and we had $800,000 in money in the bank waiting to close.
Oh, so your investors had wired their funds
Yeah,
already.
the investors had wired their funds, so we got the money. Now we were ready. We're ready to close. The lender calls us and they said, we have great news for you. We've been able to move you to the next pool, which means we can close on the first couple days of February, which was great because for us, it was a net positive of around $30,000. Well, it was maybe a net positive of more like $15,000, but because we were already at about the middle of the month. But at the end of the day, it was a good thing. So we said, fine, that's great. Let's do that. And they said, okay, well, now that the year is closed, if we don't close now, you have to just update your financials and give them back to us. And one of the things we need end of year operating statement for the property. So all of 2018. So that was no problem because we had access to the system. We just called and talked with the seller, and we said, are you done with all of your billing entries? And your we know your income's got to be accounted for. No one waits 3 weeks to put their income in. That's we know you're not doing that, but are your bills all accounted for? Yeah, everything's done. We didn't tell him what we were going to do it for. We just asked him if he was done with it. And so we reran everything. We reran trailing 3, 6, 9, and 12 months because this was January. That means all of 2018. And upon evaluation, what we found, unfortunately, was about $50,000 in additional expenses that hadn't been reported previously. Well, that's a big hit. That's a very negative outcome.
What does that mean? So $50,000 in additional expenses, what does that mean to the bottom line?
Right. Well, so we've already talked about this. This was a 10 cap purchase based on actuals. So that equates to about $500,000 in property value. The way we were calculating.
So on a $1.9 million purchase price, if you discover $50,000 in additional expenses that weren't accounted for, at a 10 cap, that equates to $500,000. So that $1.9 million complex that you're buying is really only worth $1.4 million.
That's right. Yeah, and it was devastating. I mean, it was really. I mean, it was a very bad feeling to find that. So I don't want to go into too much detail about what happened next, but I do want to give your listeners a fair estimation. We had some very frank discussions with the broker and the seller, and we asked him, what are these expenses? And the summary of the response is, oh, everybody does that. This is just for tax purposes. And we were shocked. Frankly, we were shocked. So what it boils down to is I think what the seller was trying to tell us is they were intending to commit tax fraud. Now, that left us in a very difficult position.
By inflating their expenses, or
by inflating their expenses. That's how it was described to us.
Right, but then the question is, were they real expenses?
Right,
that would have been your expenses
correct.
too.
So we were in this situation. Either the seller was defrauding the government, or they were attempting to defraud us. Because if the expenses were real, they had lied to us, and if the expenses were fake, they were defrauding the government. In either case, we had to give the operating statements to our lender, and it was impossible to move forward almost because
what did your lender say when
we didn't even talk to the lender about it because we knew immediately what the lender would say. If $50,000 in NOI disappears on $190,000 on NOI, it's a different deal. I mean, the underwriters, it would sink the deal. We were almost certain of that. And we didn't even want to have that discussion with them. We just knew it was not going to work. So we had a difficult decision to make. The question was, well, first of all, what was the reality? Were we being lied to, or was he really attempting to just defraud the government? Okay, and I'm saying that I don't know that for certain. I mean, let me
ask you, because sometimes people try to expense their capital expenditures, which are supposed to be depreciated over a period of time. They'll move them up to their expense column. Is that what they were doing? Was just trying to expense some of their capital expenditures?
Right, and I think that's the right way to look at it. And the question is that what was happening? Mm-hmm. And so here's what we did with the information that we had on hand. Because we had done such an extensive look at how the money was spent already, we went back and ran the reports, and we identified, and what was happening was every month there was a $4,000 to $5,000 discrepancy, and it was strange that it was just every single month there was $4,000 to $5,000 worth of expenses that were not, accounted for and given to us. It is possible that was the case, what you just described, expensing versus capitalizing. I don't believe, after reviewing all of the details, that was what was happening.
Well, you would have been able to see, which capital expenses were they just reallocating to
we were able
yeah.
to see. And as a matter of fact, we were able to reach back out to the vendors and have a discussion with them. Because he didn't say they were doing that. What he said was, no, this is what everyone does. This is just changes for tax purposes. Don't worry about it.
But it's still unaccounted for.
It was unaccounted for. Yeah. So, we simply called the vendors because we had access to the system that he did not take away from us, and looked up what got added by way of deduction. We could see, because when we were calling vendors, we ran out a list of expense by vendor. Right, so then we ran it out again, and you could see, look, this May 2017 expense wasn't on the other report. Okay, call the vendor. Here's the invoice number. Is it real? And that's what we did. And turns out that those expenses were real.
So you determined that the $50,000 in additional expenses that hadn't been there when you first ran the reports, and then found that the expenses from the previous year had just been underreported.
And they seemed like they were real expenses. Now, we never got to the full $50,000. We weren't able to call on every single one, so we don't know.
But you called on enough to realize
that they were real. Number mm-hmm. one, they weren't just some fictitious thing. So we came to the conclusion that we were the ones that were being defrauded. I mean, there's really not another way for me to put it, other than that. I mean, his explanation when we spoke with him about it was, it's totally normal for a pro forma to not reflect real numbers, which might be true going forward. That might be an accepted industry practice.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true that the pro forma is not going to,
Right.
pro forma is showing you the future of what it could be.
Right.
But when you actually do your real due diligence, that's
right.
where you're supposed to see the real numbers.
Right.
And if you're being defrauded, then
Right.
luckily
so his
you found out
explanation
beforehand.
was, it was unbelievable, incredible, meaning not believable at all. So as frustrating as that was, we were faced with a difficult choice. It did look like a number of those expenses were one-time expenses that were probably really expenses, but you might be able to move them into capital repairs.
Or just one-time type.
Or
items,
just
yeah.
one-time type thing. Now, what we're faced with a more difficult question, and we have a fiduciary responsibility to our investors. We've made certain predictions about where we think we're going in the future, so we've got to protect them at this point. So the question isn't about the expenses, because we could just bake those expenses back in, and even if they happened again the next year, where we thought we would be wasn't as good. We thought we might meet our investors' preferred return, but we wouldn't make very much. But the bigger question is this: if he's going to lie and try and defraud us on the expense side, how much do we trust the income side? And really, the lifeblood of all investment real estate is the income. I mean, it's called income property for a reason. And if the income isn't there, or you don't believe it's there, you should be extremely cautious about moving forward. And so we just knew from what the seller was doing in other aspects of his business that there was a real possibility that he might have been propping this up for sale. Now, I don't have any evidence that that's the case, but I do have a strong suspicion that he wasn't being honest with us in other areas if we caught him not being honest in this one area.
Mm-hmm. Had there been other red flags leading up to that point?
No, actually. I don't want to say anything more about the seller because I don't want to, give away their identity in any way. Mm-hmm. But is the type of person who is experienced in the industry, who is well regarded among others, the type of person that people would expect to be ethical and moral with respect to handling finances. And in this case, our judgment was that that's not the type of person this was. So that led us to a very difficult decision, and that was to back out of the purchase.
What were those conversations like between you and your partner, and possibly you and your investors?
Well, it started with a series of discussions with my partner Matt, and the thing that I really like about Matt is that he is the most ethical, moral person you could ever ask for from a partner. So it's super easy to know that he's always going to do the right thing. So that's the exact right person that you want to have. I would trust him implicitly with, my parents' money, my money. Like, he's never going to put his self-interest above doing what's right. There's always a right time. The time's always right to do the right thing. That's his motto. If you ever Skype Matt, and that's his little motto on his Skype. So that's great. So it's easy, but also a very difficult conversation because we knew that personally we were going to be out each tens of thousands of dollars in the way things developed. Now, what it started out with was our earnest money deposit was already hard. So that's $60,000. And everything else, the way it worked out, there was about another $40,000 there. So we got the broker and the seller on the phone, and we said, okay, we've determined based on our investigation that you weren't being truthful with us. We want our earnest money deposit back. The seller was reluctant at first during the conversation, said no. And our follow-up was at the end of this conversation, we're either going to have to make everything public, right, about what's happened here, and we'll take you to court and we're going to get our money back, plus all of our other sunk costs, plus our legal fees, or you can just give us our earnest money deposit back and you can go on to the next person. And in a few minutes, within about 30 seconds, that was the decision that was reached. So we got our money back, our earnest money, which was nice. And we got a little lesson, which was also nice because, education is great. And so that's sort of how that went. And once we came to the conclusion that we couldn't be certain on the income side, then we thought we might really be putting our investors at pretty high risk. And in our estimation, I don't think we could do that without trying to personally compensate our investors. Not that wouldn't have been required, but that would have been probably where we came out. And we'd rather just lose our money than put anybody else at risk.
Right. You have an obligation to your investors whose money you're bringing into the deal to make sure it's going to perform the way that you projected it's going to perform.
Yeah. And now the money, we're talking a lot about the money and the loss of this $40,000 for my partner and I, but that wasn't the hardest part of the conversation. And it's not even close. I would have rather lost another $20,000 personally to just not have the next series of conversations with our investors where we had to tell them that we narrowly avoided being defrauded in some way. Because it's just, I'll be honest with you, it's a little embarrassing to sit with people who, we raised $800,000, had it all ready to go. And these are people that, in all honesty, hardworking, average people who work a long time to save the amount of money that they were able to entrust to us, right? And so that, everyone was very understanding and they were all very grateful that we were doing the right thing. And, the right thing was the minimum thing that we could have done, in our opinion, though. So I think that we didn't lose the trust of our investors at all, but man, it was an embarrassing conversation to have.
Yeah, I can imagine. I've had those conversations myself. How many of those investors ended up placing their money in other deals with you?
All of them.
Okay, so you brought them into the next deal,
right? But and every one of them asked the question, "How do we know this isn't like?"
Yeah, how do we know this isn't Georgia?
Yeah, what are you doing to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And in honesty, the next purchase that they all came in on was a bank receivership, so it was a little bit easier. We knew that the bank receivership, we were able to see all the expenses, and we had some faith they didn't have an ulterior motive for hiding expenses or inflating income. So that's such a great lesson in just doing your due diligence and really poring over all the data and the information. You guys could have easily not found this $50,000 discrepancy, not looked for it, maybe not questioned it, but you did all those things, and it sounds like you made the right decision. You definitely, looking back, do you feel you made the right decision? Oh yeah, I definitely think so, and we'd make that decision every single time. There is no question about what the right thing to do is in this type of situation, and if it materially impacts the outcome of the investment, you have to do the right thing, 100%.
Yeah. So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What advice would you have for them if they're, no matter the size of the deal, what is your advice to listeners?
So you need to be very critical about the information that you're being provided. But you also need to be reasonable as well. So we had income from that was reported from the seller, and it roughly matched the amount of income we would have expected. But we weren't overly critical. So as part of this evaluation, I mentioned this earlier, we saw that the income statement that was going into the bank was very close to what we would have expected within sort of a range of error that would have been logical, given the fact that some deposits are reported and then they actually go in on the next business day.
There's a time lag
there's a little time lag
when expenses are incurred and when they actually are booked.
So if we're within 1 or 2% there, we're not expecting any huge swings, especially if you see it's made up in the following month type situation. So we weren't being overly critical. I wouldn't advise that any listener is that way, or expects down to the penny detail, especially because down to the penny detail accuracy is not necessarily important for the big picture. But definitely look for red flags. When we go to a property, and everyone we've done since then, we just ask who's doing the work. You don't mind if we go talk to them, right? I mean, it shouldn't be a big problem. A lot of owners don't want you to talk to the people who are living there because they don't want to freak them out. But they don't really care if you call the plumber or you call the electrician, or if you can see how they're spending their money. That's great. We're in a very competitive market though, so the opportunity to get that much detail, it doesn't come early on in the process. You have to get the seller committed to selling you the property, and then you're going to have to dig for those details. And there's no problem with putting that in a purchase agreement that you want to see, who the vendors are, who the major vendors are, and then you can talk with them.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Talk to the vendors. Talk to the people who are actually doing the work on the property.
Right.
And can tell you the real scoop.
Yeah.
Because you find out things that you wouldn't ordinarily discover.
Right.
So, Ken, if someone wanted to get a hold of you, how would they do so?
Yeah, so I can be reached at kenj@thepropmanagers.com. So that's KenJ@thepropmanagers.com. And if any of your listeners have questions or would like some unbiased advice from a third party, I'd be happy to speak with them.
Or if you have any property in Macon, Georgia, so.
Well, if you have any property in Southeast Michigan, I'd love to speak with you.
Have you sworn off out of state, or are you still looking out of state?
I won't say we've sworn it off. We have kind of a lot. It turns out that we've got some additional opportunities that have come up in the local market, and we're still aggressively pursuing those. I think we've got a strategy. Eventually, we will have to expand beyond our local market, but I will say this one stung a little bit. So
yeah.
So we've pulled back from aggressively pursuing that. Honestly, at this point, we had hoped that we would have our second or third acquisition in place in that submarket. And clearly we have none right now, and it's really directly related to this happening.
Yeah, definitely real estate investing can be painful. Don't let anyone tell you that it's all blue sky and pots of gold.
Right.
I appreciate you sharing your pain with us and taking us through the process. So the reason I enjoy talking with you on the podcast is because you're very thorough. So when you talk about a deal, it's like a case study. And I know if you go back and you listen to episode 16 and 17, which is way, way back, like 4 years ago, you can hear if you liked what Ken had to say today, you can hear some really two very different but yet really interesting case studies of how you acquired two off-market properties. And I want to thank you again today for doing it again, giving us a great case study and how to walk away from a deal and what to look for to find those red flags.
All right. Thanks a lot, Brian.
I want to thank everybody for listening to this episode. I'm your host, Brian Hamrick from Hamrick Investment Group, and you can find out more about me by going to higinvestor.com. That's higinvestor.com. And you can also ask questions and join us on Facebook by going to RPOA, Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast. This episode was sponsored by Green Property Management, managing everything from single-family homes to apartment complexes in the West Michigan area. Find out more at greenpropertymgt.com.
You've been listening to the Rental Property Owner and Real Estate Investor Podcast, brought to you by the Rental Property Owner Association. You can find out more at rpoaonline.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please go to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and review.